housekeeping. So start with some housekeeping. First housekeeping, actually important one. This meeting is being recorded. Please remain on mute or raise your hand if you're online. We'll keep an eye out. We'll call on you to ensure that everybody gets into the conversation. So we'll go through, we'll do some roll call, the housekeeping, fun stuff like that. We have a placeholder for the Chief Resilience Officer, Mike Hinson, to give us an update on the work of the Chief Resilience, of the Resilience Office. Apologies. And that's a standing agenda item for the ARWG. It is due with the new role. Then we're going to have a model climate elements discussion, which we led by O. Bailey, Research Shoreline Conservancy. So thank you very much for that. Then we'll have a discussion about equitable funding. It's a panel discussion. Then we'll have Humma Sharif from PNC, Casey Wessel from the Chesapeake Bay Trust, and Mariah Davis, the very own Mariah Davis, for resources. And I think we've had some really great conversations recently about how we better engage the community and how we better build projects. And I think equity really is the central point there. So excited about having that conversation in the funding space. And then we'll have our conversations about recommendations. We're at that season where the Maryland Commission on Climate Change puts together the annual report and brings forward recommendations from each one of the working groups. This year will be a little bit different with the 4 new statutorily created working groups. So a lot more work in a lot of different spaces, and we'll make sure at the commission level that all of that is well coordinated. Then we'll finish with public comment. So if you are a member of the public in the room or online, we'll have time at the end for you to make public comment as well. All right, so I will jump right in. If you've, actually, let's start with roll call first. Ready? Eric Myers. We have Bob Allen. Oh, representing Bob. Yes. Okay, great. Frederica Moser.
Present.
Thank you. Randy Espinola.
Here.
Matt Rowe. Ann Harrison Strick.
Here.
Sarah Bender.
I'm here.
You. Tom Parham.
Here.
Thanks, Tom. Jim, I see you online. Are you on for Matt?
Yes, I am. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Clifford Mitchell. Debbie Hare Cornwell.
Here.
You. Nadia Shahab.
Here.
Allison Brightmother.
Present.
Catherine McCall.
Here.
Katie Cox.
Here.
John Papavassiliou. And Bill Foster. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we have a quorum. Great. We'll now move on to approving the minutes from the May 29th meeting. Does anybody have any edits, amendments that they would like for the meeting minutes from May 29th? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes? Second? Second?
Second.
Thank you. All right, the meeting minutes are approved. We are now going to move on to the.
We had a quick announcement about.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. So we have made a change. The Maryland Commission on Climate Change Workgroup recordings and meeting minutes have now been uploaded to the Commission's YouTube page, and that satisfies the Open Meeting Act requirement for our meetings. Would the ARWG members approve a shift to left's detailed meeting minutes in addition to this recording? Yeah, I'll rephrase that. So we are posting online the full recording of all of our meetings instead of just the meeting minutes. And so that will give the public a greater opportunity to go back and see what was discussed. Because we are adding that additional level of information, we would like to go to more of a synthesized or summarized meeting minutes. And we wanted to have a brief discussion and see if there's approval from the work group members on that. Yes, Ms. Rahi.
Yes, for disability accessibility reasons, since you do have your chat enabled, I wonder if you can also just at the end of each call, just save the transcript and post the transcript for those of us who need written information.
Absolutely. I think that's a great suggestion, and we will do that as well. All right. So is there a motion to approve that change?
See what's in the chat. Sorry, feel like it feels wrong one.
I move to approve the motion to simplify the notes, making sure there are accommodations and using the full recording. Thank you.
Thank you. A second.
Support that.
Great. Thank you all. I guess we will make sure that we have the full transcript as well. Make sure that it's accessible to all of the Maryland residents. Thank you all very much. Okay, we are going to move on now to the Office of Resilience for an update. Mike, are you on the call?
Indeed, I am. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you great.
Excellent. Thank you so much for giving the time. Really appreciate it. As Secretary Kurt said, it sounds like there's a packed agenda, so we will keep it concise. So I just want to take a second to thank those who were involved in the Resilient Maryland Operations and Planning group effort, as well as the Resilient Maryland Leadership Council. We've had really a lot of progress in our work towards creating a statewide resilient strategy. I'll hold off on getting too far into that because I want Summer, the Deputy CRO, to speak to that a little bit more in just a second. But I just want to extend my sincere thanks to all those who are putting in time and effort. And we can't wait to be at a point where we can share more of that with this group. And we're hopefully moving in the right direction to do that in the near future. Beyond that, I wanted to let folks know that we've begun reaching out to local governments. We had talked about with the creation of the Maryland Office of Resilience that we needed to not only focus on state government, but make sure that we were reaching local governments as well. What we do at the state, we all know, is just one piece of resilience. And so we've really gotten deep into reaching out to local governments and finding out all the various folks who are doing a lot of these same tasks at the local level and trying to build that community of practice and that Rolodex, so to speak, so that we have better communication in the future. And to that point of better communication in the future, I just want to also mention that we'll have a newsletter upcoming, be a regular posting from us. It'll hit on new projects, best practices, new funding streams, closeout dates for upcoming grant opportunities, and anything else kind of in the resilience space as we go forward. We're hoping to have the first one of those out in October, so before the next meeting here. So we look forward to getting folks' feedback when that first one comes out. And any of you who are interested in that but are not a part of our regular communications, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I want to pass it to Summer Modafino, the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer for the state, who can get into the statewide resilience strategy and the resilience toolkit, which started really as a part of this group. So thank you. Summer?
Great, thanks, Mike. Yeah, like Mike said, we have two major projects that are in the works right now. One of them is the statewide resilience strategy, which I think we mentioned on the previous ARWG, but as a refresher, that's where we're coordinating across agencies in those work groups that Mike described in order to put together kind of high-level recommendations on resilience for the state. And one of the first things that we're working on in concert with those work groups is doing a crosswalk of existing resilience and adaptation plans. And so that is one of the big steps that we are on right now. We were able to source, I think, 30 to 40 plans from across different state agencies. So we're going through to understand what recommendations are already out there, what progress has been achieved, what themes we can lift up, where there might be gaps or just a difference in scope between our strategy, which is all hazards, and some of the previous plans, which have kind of differing scopes than that. So there's a lot more to come on that. We'll be dividing the plan up into sectors, and so there will be more opportunity for additional stakeholders to participate in sector-specific work groups. So you'll probably hear from us a lot about that in the coming ARWG calls, but just wanted to give a little status update there. The second project, which Mike mentioned, is the Resilience Toolkit. And like he said, I know this group has been really involved in sharing data and information about resilience programs for that toolkit. That'll be an online public-facing tool where anyone in Maryland can go ahead and search for different resilience funding programs, data sources, tools, plans, basically kind of a one-stop shop on resilience to help aggregate things into one place to bring down a little bit of the barrier to entry for trying to understand what resources are out there for resilience. So we have been working on that, using all the information that you all have provided and also building off some existing work within MDEM that folks were doing ahead of us. And we should be able to launch phase 1 in September. So we are very, very close, just kind of finishing touches on this. Not going to give you an exact date yet, so that we don't, oversell, underdeliver, but it will definitely be out sometime in September, and we will share it with all of you, and also be looking for your feedback so that we can make phase 2 even better. So that's the update from us.
If folks in the room are speaking, the
Ah,
folks
yes.
virtual can't hear. Go ahead.
Yep, apologies, we were muted, I missed that one. I was saying all sorts of nice things about O, and then now I'm not. So we're gonna have a conversation now about a climate resilience element, and the focus here is this is a tool for local governments and municipalities and communities to use in their comprehensive planning as it pertains to building resilience. And I was thanking ESLC for their partnership and their work, and how well they work within community on the shore. So Owen, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Secretary Kurtz, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. In addition to being the Director of Land Use Policy at ESLC, I'm also the Chair of the Town's Urban Committee with the Delmarva Restoration Conservation Network. And over the last year and a half, we've been developing this model climate resilience element, which was built off of a previous coastal resilience element that former staff member Brian Ambrett developed with help from the Department of Planning. The idea was to help our local governments put more climate resiliency into their comprehensive plans, knowing that those comprehensive plans are key master plans that will help our local governments both understand the issues that they're facing from a climate resilience perspective and also help them go after funding. And in return, also see what other projects are out there, what other needs out there, so that instead of being this town and this town, this county, and this county, we could potentially pull together resources on a more of a regional level and tackle these big projects that, these impacts of climate change don't care about municipal or county lines. They're going to affect our region as a whole. We should start looking at this as a whole. Can I have the next slide, please?
Sorry.
Yes, so this is just a little bit of information about the DRCN. We have a website that has our mission, vision, value statement on there. We are a group of nonprofits and government agencies across not only Eastern Shore, Maryland, but all of Delmarva. And this project has been the focus of the town's urban committee, which we've also partnered with Department of Planning, especially regional offices on this project. It has sort of it's not broken up by the chapters you see in the comprehensive plan. It's more of a choose your own adventure. Different ideas of infrastructure, land use, impacts from different levels of climate change. And it asks you questions on what is your community experiencing? And here's some suggestions on where to put this information, whether it should go into your land use chapter, your municipal growth element, your transportation, the new housing chapter. It gets local governments asking us all these questions, and the answers don't have to be very well detailed. The comprehensive plan, for anybody just know it, it's not a very detailed document, more of an overarching need and vision for the future of the community. But having these elements in there can be very powerful for local government when going after funding. We've seen it in a number of projects with counties in particular that have updated their comprehensive plan recently, like Queen Anne's County, which has a very robust comprehensive plan. It really puts them ahead of other counties. So we want other counties to catch up in this matter, to be more competitive and more prepared. Next. A lot of words, meant to take the slide out. You can skip to the next one. These are some of the ideas we have in there. So, must be an old slide. I forgot to change that to infrastructure, not infrastructure. So for infrastructure, you might think of this going into your development regulations, your housing, public facilities, and transportation sections of your comprehensive plan. How is the heat island effect, or heat island effect from hotter summers affecting your infrastructure? How is stormwater management? Or land use and zoning, has your zoning been updated with the release of the new critical area mapping and whatnot? So that is the basic overall behind the climate resilience element. I'm going to pivot a little bit to a newer project the ESLC has been developing. The next slide. This will also have a suggestion of resources that our local governments can go to. This is still growing, it's just on the list. Knowing that there's a lot of GIS maps, there's a lot of studies, a lot of new data out there that I think our small local governments that are usually understaffed can have knowledge about, so they can go to these resources and make sure that this gets into their plans. Next slide. All right, this is it. So last year, ESLC contracted with a group called Urban 3 out of North Carolina. And they look at land use to see what is the biggest return on investment. What's the value per acre? This is a map of the Eastern Shore. And these spikes you see, these aren't skyscrapers. This is just the highest value properties throughout the Eastern Shore, the highest value developments. Most of it is in your historic cores where you have denser mixed use developments. Next slide. If you think about right now, we don't think about our cars as miles per tank. No one goes to say, I'm going to buy a car that has X number of miles per tank. Next slide. If you did, you'd probably pick that Ford F-150. We look at a miles per gallon. Next slide. Which miles per gallon, F-450 falls down, and you have this old BMW that is outperforming the Prius. We should look at our land use this way. Because right now, we look at our land use as in miles per tank. When a local government sees that Walmart wants to come in and think, oh, that Walmart's going to give us hundreds of thousands of dollars of property tax revenues. It will, but it's going to cost you 60 some acres. Whereas that small mom and pop shop downtown, yeah, it's probably not bringing in that much money, but measured at a value per acre, that mom and pop shop is way outperforming that Walmart. So Urban 3 has mapped the entire Eastern Shore with this data, and they've also included a historical analysis of before the Bay Bridge and after the Bay Bridge, which you can see a huge stark difference. Also, and this is the point I'm getting to, they included a sea level rise analysis. Next slide. But this next slide, actually. So they looked at the average 3 foot that we're projecting by 2100, and they've put that over the Eastern Shore to see where are we going to lose that valuable real estate. And when it's broken out by county, you can see the Eastern Shore counties on the bottom. The dark blue are the acres that we're going to lose, and the light blue is the productive land that we're going to use. It's kind of hard for people here in the room to see, but you can see that Somerset and Dorchester counties are going to be hit first. Especially Somerset, which you can see that Dorchester is going to lose a lot of land, but it's not going to lose as much value. Somerset County is going to lose a lot of land and that. Next slide, this shows the analysis of the towns. Interesting point here, if you look at some place like Snow Hill is going to lose a lot of land, but not a lot of value. Compare that to my hometown of Chestertown, it's going to lose a little bit of land, but a lot of value. That shows you that Chestertown is an old historic town where most of the valuable buildings are right down by the river. It was originally a port of entry. So we want to arm our local governments with this knowledge as they're preparing their comprehensive plans for climate change and climate resilience. We also want them to be mindful of, you're going to lose property tax value in the future. You're going to lose your major revenue source in the future. So you need to think, how are you going to grow away from that impact? How are you going to plan for it? How are you going to triage your properties? Which houses can you save? Which houses can you move? And which houses properties, are you just gonna have to abandon? And when are you gonna do that? Like, now's the time to start preparing for this. And it also tells a picture overall over the entire eastern shore of where we're going to see the migration. We're going to see the loss of land and value in the lower shore and not as much impact of the upper shore. So we want this analysis to show the full picture of what we're seeing in the eastern shore in the hopes that this can get into long-term master plans and begin to help our local governments think beyond those 4-year terms that our county and municipal elected officials are thinking. Think about the 52. We're going to start off with a climate resilience element with a couple of test cases. Town of Rock Hall, Town of Cheshtown. Rock Hall has already finished their comp plan update. It's not been approved yet, but it's a very strong plan. So we want to ask them, would this have been helpful for you to have when you started out? Cheshtown is just getting started, so we want to offer that to them. Same with Talbot County, our counties, to introduce this, get some feedback, and see where this is helpful or where. That's it.
Thank you very much, Sean. Yeah, and we will open it up now for questions. If you Dr. Dow said ready to go.
Good presentation. The skyscraper map that showed Ocean City is high value. But then when you go to the comparison of countywide comparison, Worcester County is like the third most impacted contract price.
I think for the other part of it, we cut Ocean City out of the analysis because Ocean City is an outlier. Like you're not going to take the development of Ocean City, replicate it anywhere else. Sure. So that's, but the analysis, if you dive more in, this is a 300 slide deck. When you get to those slides, it really shows that Ocean City is going to be enormously.
So I love the analogy of the value per acre of cars. And I've extended not one step even further to the rural working lands. And not just, are there resources that like DNR that will help communities in this process? One of the things that we're going to climate reduction, junkie, and have a role in. So looking at like forest planning at a county scale, from the landscape scale perspective.
I guess to answer your question indirectly, our hope with this data was to show sort of the spirit behind my department. If conservation is our defense, the policy is our offense. Policy is going out of communities and showing them that you should be developing from within, infill, more mixed use, walkable, denser communities. You shouldn't be sprawling out. So this data supports that. This is the best way for you to invest in your core. There's another analysis that shows the percentages that certain towns have for land mass in their county and for value in their county. My hometown, Cheshtown, it's 1% of the land mass in the county, but it's 20% of the value. So what's good for Cheshtown is great for the county. So the county should be investing. Counties should be investing in towns to help them. Because in Eastern Shore, towns are so small. They don't have a lot of assets. Cheshtown, they're about to hire the first planner ever. And when talking to the counties, yeah, they don't govern it. But they're financially invested. This really gathers at home. And I think on the flip side of that, think about how you can get more productivity out of your existing natural resources through forest management plans and stuff like we talked about in the past. So I think it's showing that flip side of it. Like, let the towns be the urban cores and the population centers, and let shore working lands be the productive working lands that they. That's the most valuable.
I like that attitude about the county engaging with the town. I live in Easton, so that's very much the case that when you talk about how big is Easton, well, it's really how big is Dalton, because that's the unit that we people operate. They use the town for all the resources.
Yeah, the county should absolutely be in the process. It should be involved with helping the county or with the town wherever they can. The analysis for Talbot County is a little different because in Talbot County, you have 3 very productive places in Easton Oxford and St. Michael's, you don't really have that in other counties. Usually they have one huge spike and then the rest is pretty small, which is not a bad thing. Right? You want that concentration. But Talbot County is pretty rare that you have that sort of that triangle of municipal law.
I would love to see you do that chart you did for cars, and I would say maybe not for a permanent surface, because that's,
Yes.
you know,
So in the full presentation of this, Urban 3 looks at like a Target parking lot, which Targets have some of the biggest parking lots in the United States. Let's say you took away half of that parking lot. And you can see the value of that property shoot up like 2-3-fold. So let's take away that impervious surface and do something with it. Put in apartments. There's a lot of value in it. It's already built. You already have infrastructure. You have more productivity out of that infrastructure.
Anybody online with questions for Owen? All right, thank you very much, Owen. Really appreciate the presentation.
Yep.
We'll just apologize for everybody in the room. It's very warm in here. So if you need to get water or anything, feel free to step outside. It's much cooler in there. For some reason.
not cooler outside.
Not outside, but it's just outside of this room. All right, so we are going to move on to our panel discussion. And this panel discussion is going to focus on equity and funding, which, as we know, is a very important conversation for us to be having as we talk about how we're going to respond and react and work with communities to ensure that we have a more resilient Maryland. Effectively, what we're talking about is local delivery, local project delivery in communities in order to build resilience. And a lot of projects all across the state of Maryland in order for us to be able to be successful. There's a planning component, as Owen pointed out in his project. There's restoration components. There's infrastructure design components. I mean, it runs a very large gamut. There's a lot of funding sources that contribute to that. So I think what we want to have is a conversation around how we can be equitable in that in terms of building resilience and adapting to an ever-changing world. So we're really excited to have the panel that we do. I'm going to introduce all three panelists to start, and then they'll go down and do some presentations. So please start thinking about questions, and then we'll have a robust discussion after each one of those. So I'll start with Una Sharif, who's from the Nature Conservancy, started in March 2023. Her role is at the intersection of climate policy, nature-based solutions, and equitable access to adaptation resources for coastal communities in Maryland. She has a bridge position and sits on TNC's government relations team to advance their resilient coast strategy. Una's focus and work is building consensus for policy priorities, finding common ground, and identifying areas where TNC can champion policy priorities in Maryland's advanced nature-based climate adaptation solutions. Thank you for being here today. Next up is Casey Wetzel. Casey is the Vice President of Programs focused on the human dimensions of the Chesapeake Bay Trust work. Casey joined the Trust in 2007 and leads a dynamic team focused on community engagement, environmental justice, environmental education, capacity building, and workforce development. And the third panelist is Mariah Davis, who is the Environmental Justice Officer here at the Department of Natural Resources. In her role, she works to ensure programs, policies, funding, and projects have positive impacts in communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And she has centered her career providing DEIJ technical assistance and policy guidance to a broad base of stakeholders across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This is a panel of people who are leading in this space, and I think all are very much community centered in the work, and excited about their perspectives and the conversation that we can have about equitable funding across the board, whether that be coming from our philanthropic spaces, state, local governments, federal government, et cetera. A lot of funding streams for us to make sure are actively, equitably distributed. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I will get started with our slides, and we'll move through these fairly quickly so we can have a lot of time for discussion. This is just an agenda overview. I will be talking about the barriers to climate adaptation, creating equitable access to funding resources, and then a few policy development areas that we have collected from conversations with our partners. And then I'll pass it over to my fellow panelists. Next slide, please. One more. Those are Chesapeake Bay oysters. As everyone in this room knows, resource allocation is inherently inequitable. We have a lot of systemic injustices built into our systems, and a few years ago, TNC started this work to start to dive into some of those things that we intuitively know, but we wanted to find out what is the data to back that up, and in what ways do those inequities show up in the communities that we want to be working with and are already working with. But as we continue to grow our work, it was really important for us to understand how these inequities manifest on a daily basis for the communities. We'll go to the next slide. Some of the impetus for this work was also the administration change. The Justice 40 commitment from the federal level brought a lot of new funding streams that were open to states and communities through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Parks and Infrastructure Act. And our state has some of the most ambitious goals in the country to advance climate adaptation and mitigation. So we have these environmental justice goals, but we need to figure out a pathway forward to actually implement them and get those resources to the communities that need it the most. It's not in these slides, but Jackie over here led the first part of this work before I joined. But we did the study of 5 states across the US, North Carolina, California, Louisiana, Maryland, and New York, and found 3 broad categories for how grant programs are not meeting the needs of the communities. And it really starts at the legislative level, where language isn't designed to meet the needs of communities. Underserved communities are usually an afterthought. We talk about equity and justice, but there usually isn't a roadmap that policymakers or climate program managers can follow and ask questions of how can we change things to better serve the needs of the communities that we want to be serving. I'll be saying that a lot in my presentation. Okay, so next slide, please. Here are the 4 big categories that we looked at. And I know that's a little bit hard to read. We will be sure to follow up with the slides with everyone. But we discussed a lot of these barriers in conversations throughout 2023 with coastal community partners, some local government officials, state agency partners. Some of you in this room were present in these conversations, and other nonprofit partners as well. So it was a group with a lot of different expertise and lived experiences coming in, and we categorize them in these 4 categories to help us think through how we get to the end result, with equity being the key driving force. And one of my colleagues used this phrase to describe it. If you're baking a cake, you want equity baked into the cake and not necessarily as frosting. Frosting is great, but it's better if it's the ingredient you're starting with. So we'll go to the next slide. For the visual learners, again, I'm really sorry, it's hard to read what's on the screen. But we also had a lot of learning styles in our group, so we wanted to create some graphics to illustrate those barriers. So if you can imagine the 4 barriers that you saw on the earlier slide as the orange lines on this slide, as these systemic barriers come in, funding often gets redirected to communities that are already well resourced. An example of that would be a county or a city that already has a staff that's thinking of resilience. If you can hire someone like a resilience planner or someone who's specifically there to think of equity elements in your comprehensive plans, I would love to follow up with you after this. That town is better able to go after grant funding that is coming out of NOAA or FEMA or EPA. And the same barriers exist at the state level as well. I know we have technical resources and technical expertise available for those who know to ask for that. So you end up in this space sometimes where you need technical assistance for technical assistance. A lot of the partners we work with often don't know that VNR offers resources, or there might be something at MDM that someone they can reach out to. So that piece of communication is really important to think about here as well. On the next slide is our visual of what an improved funding system would look like if you removed those barriers. You can see the pipelines and the water flowing more equitably to each of these places. But this really is meant as a learning visual aid. Moving on to the next slide, I will go into some of the principles that we discussed. So there is a story map and a report accompanying this. We'll follow up with all of the links with all of you here. We talked about 7 equity principles, and each of those sections in the report goes into specific recommendations, and there's almost a checklist of questions. We recognize that equity isn't a checklist item, but if you're starting to tackle this really large problem, where does one start? What are the types of programmatic changes that need to be made? We go into those in the report, and we have some case studies and examples from places that our partners shared that they thought did this thing really well. So there are a few grant programs in there too, and just really very focused examples to walk through some of these concepts. And next slide. Here are some of our decision maker recommendations. The decision maker word there was intentional. We didn't want to say policymakers only. All of us in this room are decision makers to some extent. We hold power within our programmatic area, so we have the ability to run those programs in different ways. Some of the decision making does have to happen at the legislative assembly level in terms of how new policies are being advanced. We do need new revenue streams and new funding to report into adaptation and resilience. But there is a lot of room to make sure that our existing funding streams are being distributed in ways that meet the needs of our community partners. Slide, please. One more. So I won't go into too much detail for this one. This is Seafair Part 2. So we call the first project Seafair, supporting equitable adaptation to access to adaptation resources. But this was kind of continuing to build on that work. We just shared this with all our partners a few weeks ago, and this report goes further into those policy development areas. Just something to note here, these are not policy recommendations coming from us as the Nature Conservancy. It is a synthesis of things that our partners are telling us. So again, we were meeting with partners from late 2023 to late spring of 2024, and we were talking through flooding issues, infrastructure repairs. These meetings were going on as we saw the Baltimore Key Bridge collapse, which further disconnected and underserved communities. So really tying together a lot of these different areas of adaptation that touch on emergency management, transportation, access to healthcare, access to education, jobs, housing. A lot of those are not issue areas where I have expertise or where TNC is an expert, but the point of doing this was to show how many of us need to come together in partnerships and how we can support each other in advancing really strong policy. So I would really encourage you to read that. There's a summary version of it, and the full report, we try to keep it really short, so it's not 900 pages long. And one more slide. Actually, we'll go one more. And after this, I'll just pass along to my colleagues. This is another graphic that Equitable Partners created. They were facilitating partners for the most recent report, and they just put it together again for the visual learners in the room for us to be able to see how many different sectors of our environmental climate adaptation space, how many different partners need to come together to make sure resources are allocated in a good way. Almost all of the community partners that we speak with and are working to build relationships and trust with, they know best what the needs of their towns and communities are, and they know how to solve it. We just need to be the honest brokers in the room to help connect them to things. We don't need to come up with the new innovative solutions. They have the solutions. We just need to connect them better with the money and the resources and help them communicate those ideas to places where the resources are. This is meant to showcase a little bit of that, and that I will pass over to Casey.
All right, y'all. So just really briefly for the folks that don't know who the trust is, that's our who we are. We created in '85 by the Maryland General Assembly. We administer approximately $30 million a year across the watershed, not just in Maryland. And what Hamil is just showing you, that graphic. So we would be the top left circle. We are, while we're a 501c3 public state agency, we function like a community foundation. So we pass through our own money, about $3 million of our own money a year, which is supported by a license plate that you see on cars in Maryland. But also, we partner with state agencies, federal agencies, private funders, corporate funders, nonprofits, local governments, and we create pooled funds, right? So we zip together different kinds of funding and we administer those dollars together to nonprofits and community-based organizations all across the watershed. So we can move on to the next slide. So really briefly, I'll be as brief as I possibly can be. The trust started our North Equity, Inclusion, and Justice work in early 2000s. And at the time, we called it our Minorities in the Environment Initiative. We don't call it that anymore, don't worry. But we did a bunch of listening sessions with our grantees and folks that had not applied to us in the past. And we instituted a couple policies as a result. One of our first policies in terms of equity, just as an example, was we ran a youth environmental education program. We had a bunch of schools applying to us that were completely free and reduced lunch schools, right? And we decided at the time that we would allow those groups to be released from a match requirement. So those folks could apply for all the funding that they needed. Any schools that didn't run a full school-wide free and reduced lunch program still had to provide a match if they wanted to access it. We have a number of other things like that now. At the time, that was one of our first equity criteria in our. Those are just short examples. We have since established, between 2008 and 2017, we established an external advisory committee to the trust that advises us on DEIJ work, diversity, inclusion, justice work. We developed an action plan, a work plan for the staff on how we're going to integrate DEIJ into our work. A number of internal and external changes were made, and then we also hired in 2017 an external auditor to come in and audit our work to give us more direction on how we can improve our DEIJ work plan. So a third party gave us direction as well. More recently, we created an internal action committee because we always had like one staff member that was sort of like doing the thing and just wasn't a good plan. So we created a group, a cross collaborative committee on our staff that is moving forward our action plan. We worked with Chesapeake Bay Funders Network and the Fuse Clean Water Coalition to do a 8-month-long training series. Let me take a step back and say we did a lot of survey work first, and that analysis, which we're happy to share with you, granted it's a little dated now, that came out in 2019. Was a kind of a landscape analysis of the movement in the area with the nonprofits and funders efforts working in the DEIJ space as well. So we had like a baseline set of data. We developed a guide. You can see a picture on the upper right-hand corner for everyone. And there's a whole section for funders on that have recommendations on how they could better integrate DEIJ practices and philanthropy. And then there is a whole section for nonprofits as well. We're actively working to re-update that. 2019 was a long time ago, and so we'll be redoing the survey, redoing the guide, and we'll be creating public-facing training modules. We also fund individual groups to hire DEIJ external auditors for themselves. We also want to create more easily accessible modules for folks to access to learn about internal and external work. We then put a group of funders and nonprofits. It was a group of about 50 folks through an 8-month training series from a group called Race Forward, Third Space Action Lab. They do something pretty nationally known called the groundwater training. If anyone's ever interested in going through some really progressive DEIJ training work, really good group. And that has kind of resulted in an effort for us to get really curious about how we disaggregate our data as an organization. So we've long tracked who receives our grants and whether or not they would give us data on the percentage of people they felt they were engaging that would identify as people of color. We've gotten way more specific about demographic data collection, and we're now disaggregating that data to understand the impact by those subcategories. We can talk about that a little bit, disaggregation of data. But so that's where we're at. That's the background on where the trust has been internally and externally in our work in this space. We can move to the next slide. Some of the other work that we do that is very in line with what Hamna was talking about. I know some, like she said, you can see some of those graphics, but we have a capacity building initiative. It was started in 2005. It's a shared initiative with Chesapeake Bay Funders Network. So there's 9 funders behind the initiative, private funders, as well as EPA is behind it as well. And then the trust obviously puts funding into it. It's grown to about a $2 million a year initiative on average. And we have 3 components to it. We invest in cross-sector networks. So the trust will that I'm not briefly mentioned. So we realized that to broaden the base of support for the work, we had to build trust among non-environmental groups and environmental groups long-term. We're currently in a 5-year long-term funding commitment to 5 different networks across the region that bring together social services groups, migrant farm workers' rights groups, and environmental groups, just to name examples, right? And they work at the nexus of community health and environmental well-being, right? The collaborative work I could talk about for a long time. We have a consultant on hand that does network analysis to ensure that we're building networks that can sustain, right? And we invest about $250,000 a year in their work. Organizational capacity building, individual nonprofits. We provide grants between $30,000 and $50,000 a year to support strategic planning, fundraising planning, communications planning, all the plannings. And then, equipment. People need computers, right? The groups that we're talking about in these spaces, they don't have the inequity that Hamna was talking about exists for the organization itself, right? And so we've also changed our criteria and broadened it. So the origins of that initiative were that we just funded watershed organizations. We changed that in 2014. And we now will entertain proposals for capacity building from any entity that can demonstrate a natural resources component to their strategic plan, which was an equity position. And then lastly, we do movement building. So some of the work I talked about, that like 8-month training series, right? That's an example of movement training works. We follow a bunch of surveys in the region. Sierra Price does a great capacity building survey. Houston Water Coalition does a great survey. And we take cues from what it is that the movement wants and needs. And then we hire folks to provide trainings that are useful, or produce products and services that are useful to build capacity in that regard. That photo is on a group of some of the networks. They had a 3D retreat. But we can move on to the next slide. We have a partnership with DNR that does technical assistance model work. And we worked with Sarah on it to initially conceive of the concept. And it puts groups on contract in community that are in frontline and fence line communities to do outreach to potential new groups that might be interested in more technical grant programs. It also puts engineers on contract to help them conceive of more technical restoration projects and help them write proposals. Some of the RFPs, despite our best efforts to take out some of the technical stuff, are a little hard. So, having somebody on hand to connect them with that group, they go out on site, they help them to shape the project, they help them write the proposal, navigate the process. It's a technical assistance model, right? But it's also resourcing the groups on the ground to identify who these groups should be that should receive the technical assistance. We aren't identifying the groups, right? So the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund is a participatory fund. That's a model in philanthropy that's become fairly popular in the last 10 years. That is, so participatory philanthropy is essentially, I have to go back to the set room. It's a succession of power to those that are most impacted in the decision-making process. So we talk about this till the cows come home. There's a big continuum on the philanthropic side on what is participatory philanthropy, but ultimately, if you're ceding decision-making power in different capacities, then you're doing a form of participatory philanthropy. I can talk to you about how that'll look for our work. We are passing through federal dollars, not best match in terms of like the philanthropic process for a participatory fund, but we're going to make it work, and we have a lot of really cool ideas there. And then we're going to be we're developing implicit bias training for all our external reviewers. So there's some things that are coming up. There's so much more, but we're real tight on time here, so that's it.
We built some flexibility.
Okay. So I'll pass the mic.
So what can state agencies do? So much. I have had the opportunity in my previous roles to work with Casey and the philanthropic community, and I think there's a lot of great tools out there that can help inform our work, including the Seafarers recommendations. These are just very, very quick ideas, but when Governor Moore was elected, he made it a priority to have justice at the forefront of his work, and has hired other colleagues and other state agencies across the state to do this type of work. So I've had the pleasure of being able to meet and start coordinating with other state agencies. I think that that is something that we need to be doing more, but also I think that there needs to be a formalization of that work that can really enable us to work more, with these kinds of committees and work groups, and to provide high level recommendations. There's a lot that state agencies can do as well as around, pulling resources and expertise. Justice 40 has a lot of really great examples and recommendations that I think we could be implementing here at the state level. I would love to see a Maryland Justice 40 fund, with dedicated funding that we don't have to continue to fight for and, get this one off program here, this one off program here. I would love to see, just those continued and pulled resources. We have a lot of, expertise in the room, but I think there's also a lot of room that we can do to invite the communities in. I think we have a lot of barriers to access and to entry. There's just a lot as well, just within our own grant programs that we can be doing. So I think this list is endless, but I'm really glad to be working with a lot of colleagues who are here in this work group from other state agencies. And I think there's so much more that we can do and have the power to do. Next slide. DNR's work to date, this is a very, very short list. I was very excited and pleased just to see a lot that had been going on in the natural resources space around addressing climate and environmental justice and inequities, and really trying to get resources into the hands of the communities that need it the most. So we've done some, tool and resource development. We have a park equity mapping tool that was developed with the University of Maryland in partnership with them and the creators of the Maryland EJ Screen. So this is a tool that's out there and publicly available to assess, where are our, barriers to access for nature? Where can we have more public spaces? I was just having a conversation earlier with Elliot today that there are so many tools out there. What if we just brought all the tools together that we have? But what I would really love to see is having more social scientists in the room and really taking the data into words. I don't see that enough. I'm not a GIS expert. I know that people who are disenfranchised are probably either, especially people of a second language. So I think that there's a lot that we can be doing to interpret our science and really bringing it into layman's terms. That's an access issue. That's an accessibility issue. So as we're thinking about, tool and resource development, I think we need to simplify those things as well. Interpreting difficult histories. Our director of the Maryland Park Service, Angie Crenshaw, has been doing a lot of work to talk about how has racism showed up, not just in parks, but in our natural resources management. We have a lot of segregated beaches, for example, throughout the state. But there's a lot to celebrate in that work. I'm sure you all have heard of Carr's Beach, but I think it's important to know our history and important to know the role that we have played in racism and environmental injustices and climate injustices, so that we know where we're going. So that's an exciting thing that we've been able to work in partnership with the Department of Archives to bring that information to the forefront. It's not anything to be embarrassed about, but it's something to just be real about, so that we can help drive better solutions. Increasing resources. These are just a few programs that all have an environmental justice aspect to them. Our Green Space Equity program actually just launched. This is a new program. Legislation passed a couple years ago. It's a land acquisition program to identify green spaces and public spaces in underserved and overburdened communities. This is a really exciting thing that a lot of advocates and people are very excited about. It's important we're getting that information to communities who need it the most. Whole Watershed Act and Fund. There is an environmental justice aspect to that as well, and ensuring as we're doing holistic watershed restoration that we're also making sure that we're including environmental justice communities in that work. Community Forestry Catalyst Fund. This is also tied to implementing 5 Million Trees program in underserved communities, and also an aspect of implementing our justice supporting programs and putting trees and tree canopy in environmental justice communities and communities impacted by climate change. So those are just a few ways in which we as DNR are increasing resources, but I think there's a ton of opportunities, to work across state agencies as well and to work more holistically across DNR to implement these programs. Increasing equitable access. We just, our Office of Outdoor Rec and an environmental grant maker came together to pull together our first series of outdoor equity grants. This is to provide recreational opportunities to folks who don't always have the resources to get outside. It's really expensive to recreate. So this is something we're really excited about, something we're going to be promoting very soon. It's the first of its kind. These types of grant programs exist in other states, and it's something that we want to continue to do. And then creating culturally important programming and culturally relevant programming. So, making sure that we're connecting with the public and communities in a way that's relevant to them. I'm really proud and excited about Freedman State Park. It's a beautiful story. Essentially, there was a slave in Montgomery County who ended up acquiring and owning the land that he was enslaved on, ended up selling a part of it to create a very prominent newspaper in Baltimore. That's been an integral part of the civil rights movement. And it's just a beautiful story. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but DNR will be standing up that park and some other really cool and culturally important parks. So I think it's really important, again, that we're bringing those stories to the forefront and really talking about, the progress that we have made and the contributions that people have made over the years. SV Parque, this is a Spanish cultural event that we do in our parks every year. But there's so much here that we're doing at DNR, and I think we can take advantage of throughout our program. Upcoming work, these are all things that I'm working on with our staff. We recently adopted a new diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and access statement. I'm really proud of that and proud that we were able to bring the staff and our leadership team to adopt that work. What I've found is that environmental justice and really bringing in the climate aspect too isn't clearly defined at DNR. That's something that I'm excited to work on and work with our other sister agencies on. We need to establish metrics. I think that's really important, and defining our goals and really talking about what is environmental justice, what does climate justice mean from a natural resources perspective. I'm excited to work on an environmental justice policy. This would be a commitment, a document that we can say, this is exactly what we're doing on environmental justice, climate justice, this is what we mean, and these are our goals. So I think those types of commitments and guiding policies are really important for agencies to have, and it's only going to help us clearly define our work and set metrics for the future. Implementing an internal diversity, equity, inclusion plan. You cannot do the external work without doing the internal work. That DIJ action guide, I have it printed. I keep it in my desk. I think it's a really great, resource and something that we can, all use as a state. One thing I didn't mention in here, I guess I did on the last one, increasing equity within our grants programs. We have a lot of gaps when it comes to our funding. I think there's a lot that we can be doing, in regards to developing our RFPs and our solicitations and asking questions to grantees about, okay, how are these communities actually getting the direct benefits of the work? How are you budgeting for them? I think that there's a lot more that we can be doing, but also figuring out who are we actually giving money to and who are we not giving that money to. So there's a lot of, gaps, I think, in both our philanthropy, grant making, but also our policy. So those are all a few things I'm really excited to work on. And I think the last slide is just a wrap up. And if anyone has any questions, we're happy to take a question or two if there's time. I know that was a lot of quick information, but there's our contact information if you ever want to reach out and chat more.
And we have at least 10 minutes for discussion here. So if there are, open it up to the floor and online. Please raise your hand online if you're in the room. Dr. Dennis.
You know, we've been working on environmental justice industry for our Chesapeake watershed report several years. And we kind of settled currently on the CDCs for environmental justice index, which includes environmental burden, social vulnerability, and underlying health. But what we're missing are governance and economic. And I think what you guys are talking about, the funding is so key to the environmental justice. That coming up with some way of coming up with a way of quantifying that interest. So I'd like to follow up with the three of you because I think the governance thing, like having disadvantaged communities part of the funding decision making, that's the kind of governance that we want to see. And that to me represents more forward thinking. I think the CDC is a little bit rearview. I'd like to be looking out through the windscreen, moving forward. The funding and the governance should be much more proactive. I know it's going to be hard. I mean, these are hard. We struggle. Finally converged on the CDC thing. But 4 years of messing around, just categorizing, coming up with pressure. It's not. You can't go and get like a salt oxygen criteria for these EJ things. You got to.
For everybody in the room, we are using a stationary mic, so we're going to just need to project a little bit towards the front of the room when asking it.
One thing I didn't mention is like data and science. We do a lot of data and science collection at DNR on oysters and crabs, and all of that is really important. We don't have enough people data, but I think it's state agencies, but also just people in this room. We can be working together to have more people data.
And a lot of that could be citizen science generated too. I mean, not citizen science are of course measuring necessity and quality, but they could also help with the people data gathering.
I was just going to ask, is that more about the demographics of, let's say, the fishermen who are getting the crabs and getting the oysters, or is it more buying the crabs and buying the oysters, or is it?
I think it's all the above, like, subsistence fishing, even just, including questions, when people come to buy licenses, for example, to say, is this your primary food source? Like, and then, demographic data, we find that 50% of the people who are buying our fishing licenses are, have immigrated here. We probably need to update our website to be in other languages. So like, it's just, I think there's a lot of basic information that we can get to make a lot of institutional changes so that we're better addressing the needs of the people. That's just one example.
Great.
Watching fishermen catch blue catfish, flathead catfish out of Middle Branch, going home and eating them. It's a concern because it's contaminated water being extensively used for personal consumption.
Recognize we're not, this is a tangent, but we did a lot of work on this a few years ago, like protein exchange programs and where it's supposed to go.
Yeah.
We need to find the money elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they need to maintain their data.
I think one thing all three of you touched on in different ways is the concept of trust building. I think in the previous meeting, we discussed funding community liaisons. And so I was just interested to kind of get your perspective on how we equitably bring people to the table from also a funding perspective for their time. And so just wanted to kind of get a sense for how you all see kind of trust building, and then also the opportunity for financial incentives to help us build trust.
Yeah, I could go first. Yes, so that idea has come up. Sabina and I have chatted about that idea. I think the community partners that I have worked with, and it's not representative of the whole state. There's only so many people who will be able to reach, and it has been a continuous funding process. I think providing them with access to these spaces is really important. So an example last year, as I was doing the work on one of these reports and we were in the middle of the state session, I really wanted to bring some of our partners to Annapolis with us and help them do some of the bill testimonies and help them see how the process moves and works and have them be present. And we didn't really account for the budget or the time it would take for them to travel from the Eastern Shore. Well, we accounted for the time, but we didn't think we should have. I didn't have the budget to be able to reimburse them for the cost of doing that. And some people didn't have cars or easy access to daycares, and that ended up becoming a big barrier to their participation. They wanted to be there, but we needed to have thought a few steps ahead and provided that stipend up front or offered to them, actually, we might be able to take on this cost. And when the day came, they ended up canceling and shared with me, actually, this is really hard for us to do. So that's just one example of when we're thinking of accessibility in the political process. It's really daunting for them to be present in these spaces because also some of the concerns that have been shared with me are, oh, we don't really know the policy language. We don't know who else will be there. Will we be presenting these ideas in a way that's okay? And then if those concerns are alleviated, do we as an organization have the capacity to pay them for their time?
Especially when the time is never on time.
I have sat in that place for an entire day. Those take 2 hours.
Doesn't really get at the community liaison question, but one thing I think about in regards to that is like the indigenous and native community, like they're just people that are existing. Like they're not an environmental group, like they can start a nonprofit to go work on X, Y, and Z. Like they're just there and existing and they've been stripped of environmental rights. So what are we doing as people in power to remove barriers for them to get access to the things that they have been denied? Like I think that is a justice, outcome and things that we can directly impact at little to no cost. So I think there's a lot of, in regards to what we're saying, that just requires behavior change. It doesn't necessarily require increased resources. It just requires us changing our processes around reimbursements, for example. Like that's a huge barrier, or being able to, continue to fund efforts like the capacity building efforts, to assist people in writing grants. Like that just takes some time and some strategic thinking. But some of this stuff takes a lot of resources and then some don't. And really it's just being able to provide space to people to be the experts and us to really step aside and let them advocate on issues that they're experts in.
The only thing I want to add to that is like, so Ryan said earlier in the guide, the DI guide talks a lot about this, is like establishing internal policies that shift things and then shifting to external work. So a lot of us have been responding to, I'm just gonna make a broad brush assumption on for a lot of folks on the call too, that we've been responding to submitting proposals to this IRA, right? And everyone's, have their head down and they're struggling to meet these deadlines. And, you got to write a 20-page proposal and then you got to pull together a budget and you're trying to communicate with finance people and get pay rates. Everyone's struggling and there's no pause to say, did you write into the budget for your partners to access funding, right? The stipend conversation is a good one. There's also perception from 2 CFR 200, that's the Federal Code of Regulations that governs federal pass-through, that you can't use it for stipends. That's not true. It's just that you have to document, right? And you have to get W-9, you have to document that you received it, so forth. Like you have a lot of documentation, but you can do it. And there's a lot of lawyers out there in our different institutions that have interpreted 2 CFR 200 differently on a lot of different stuff, including this particular topic, right? We have to question that, right? And then we have to create internal checklists about the pause on equity for the budget itself, right? When we're creating the budgets and we're trying to get funding to pass through to partners. That's my strong opinion. And ultimately, there's like the shift to the external work, right? How does that administered? Is that administered equitably? What are our evaluation things?
And to add to that, Casey, I think a lot of the times what it comes down to is making sure that when you're working with these, communities, is that you're you're giving them the right information. Because a lot of the times we have these timelines and these deadlines and, you start the work and then 10 months go by and you realize nobody's gotten paid. So I think we also have a responsibility to, like say the correct information and talk about the correct processes from start to finish. Because we can be further, perpetuating those types of inequities, which happens a lot.
Yeah, one more thing to add to that is matching requirements. They have been significantly reduced, but not completely eliminated through the Justice 40. So I'll use the example of Chrisfield. That's a city that many of my colleagues have been working with for a few years now, and they received a big FEMA grant. But the process of getting to that point for the city required several years of work. And they were able to work with the Army Corps for some with FEMA for technical assistance. But for them to even be able to access that first round of technical assistance, and the FEMA BRIC still has a reduced 10% match requirement for underserved communities. So if you're going for a large grant, 10% of 50 million is still a lot of money for that small amount to be raising. So something for us to think about as state partners and working within our state. How can we help alleviate that burden? It's one that comes up in almost every conversation I have. You can't use federal dollars to match federal dollars, so that's a big barrier.
We're doing a lot of talking in the room. Anybody online with questions or thoughts? All right. Well, thank you very much again. It was a great conversation. It really built off the conversation we had about community liaisons. I think clearly a lot of work to do, but I think that manifests a lot of opportunity. And I think it's really encouraging to see so much thought that's going in different ways in the nonprofit, the private, the grant making space. And so I think the more ARWG or any way ARWG can serve as a space for those conversations and sharing of knowledge, we continue to do that. And as we continue to think about recommendations for the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, I think this is a space where, and we've had some suggestions in the past, and I think we can really help kind of see this next conversation about our discussion. So again, thank you very much to the panelists. Really appreciate the time. The expertise and work that you all are doing in this space. Okay, now we will turn over to the business of the day. We are stepping into, as I said earlier, the kind of recommendation season for the annual report. This year, those recommendations are due by September 11th for voting and discussion at the upcoming September 30 meeting. So what we need to do today is to continue to have that conversation about the recommendations that we put out this year, and then decide what things we want to send up to the broader climate commission for conversation and discussion. This year we tried something a little bit different, so I'd also be interested to see if this works, which is we try to have these conversations every meeting so that we can start putting together recommendations to seed this discussion. I think moving forward, we want to continue to adaptively manage this process to make sure that over the course of the year, we're building on recommendations that have come before. We are learning from recommendations that either passed or did not pass in previous years. And we're kind of reimagining or rethinking about it through the context of what was debated and discussed in the legislature, if any of those recommendations turned into statute. So a lot of spaces where we're trying to pull together and synthesize and learn from around our recommendations. Ryland is doing a fantastic job of that. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Ryland to talk through some of the recommendations we've heard and to start having that discussion about advancing those to the broader commission.
Thank you. I put this slide deck together, which is literally just pitching some of those ideas we've already talked about. So hopefully there's nothing here that is shocking or new to you. It's stuff that we've already been discussing. What I'm going to do is I'll run through those ideas, and then I'm going to open the floor for discussion. And then I'm going to reserve 5-10 minutes, depending on how the discussion goes, to do a little Mentimeter with you guys and have you rank some of these ideas so we know what we're going to be pushing forward as the ARWG at the commission level. So some things to note. Again, these ideas are from the past year. I did not just invent them on my own. These are from you guys. The wording is very basic and not final. So I am not saying I'm mailing us to this wording, and that is also a subject of discussion, especially if you have feelings about some of the words used, that they should be specific words or not. These are just suggestions, so we don't have to agree on these at all, and other ideas are still welcome. So we do not have to stick to these if we think that there's other things that are more important. So this is the list of 5 that I've put together so far. I'm going to run through them and just talk about them basic ideas that we've covered. The first is enabling mechanisms in DBM for community participation in state projects. This is a direct reflection of that panel that we had at the last ARWG meeting. What this could look like is potentially trainings on the current suite of employment mechanisms. What do we already have that we actually could utilize in this capacity? And that could be something that we work with DBM to produce. What are the options for recruitment? This came up in the panel as well. The way that we do not necessarily have to follow the state recruitment or employment policy where they have to be posted and done the exact same way as every employee. So that was a little bit alluded to, and that is another thing that we can also work with DBM to create trainings or worksheets on utilizing some of these alternate mechanisms. And removing barriers to participation as a liaison, which we kind of talked about today a little bit, including that paperwork, but also the technology requirement, which was discussed in the panel. Some people don't use computers or even cell phones. So we need to think about how do we make, if they're reporting time and things like that at the state level, how do we work with people in novel ways to reduce those barriers? More flexible grant processes. Again, this is something we were just discussing today, but then we also have discussed in the past. And this would probably be a recommendation for state grants if this is going to be a Commission on Climate Change recommendation. But what we can control, things like lowered match amounts we just discussed, but also longer grant terms, giving communities longer terms to implement and multiple phases in one grant, which is a big thing we discussed at the panel last meeting. And then the option of providing money up front, which will enable more communities to be able to do the work if you're paying them in advance and not requiring them to front it and be reimbursed. We also have making information and tools more accessible through training, which again was brought up today. So I feel like we're right on the money. Acknowledging we already have a ton of tools, focusing more on providing guidance on how they should be used or could be used. And this could be a guidance document like we have for some of our tools already, but it also could be in-person trainings, open office hours and things like that. And then I believe this is the last one, supporting local governments with mechanisms like resilience authorities or novel funding mechanisms or resources that they can use. Resilience authorities is just an example because we would be the first to, I think, acknowledge that's not something that would necessarily be a recipe for success for everybody. It's not a one-stop shop. But what are other options to empower local governments and allow them to kind of capture a lot of these tools that we have out there? Oh, and then the last one, of course, work on implementing the next generation adaptation plan to advance the goals of the state resilience strategy. And I think this would be a good one to put forth to show everybody that we are intending to keep alignment with the Office of Resilience. We're not going to be completely separate efforts. They're going to be intertwined, and it will also help keep that next generation adaptation plan, which again is suggesting which items should be prioritized, should be front of mind for all state agencies. So I would like to open the floor for discussion. I flew through those because I wanted to allow a lot of time to both digest those ideas, but also time for anybody in the room to pitch anything I didn't cover that you think should be a recommendation. I'm going to flip back to my list. And I saw Allison, you raised your hand.
I was going to ask you to flip back to the list. You got it.
Same brain. So anything in the room or online? Anne?
When we're suggesting training, but I also suggest not just training, like I know they're trying to do the same thing at the federal level. They're like offering us more training on forests and carbon and climate. And it's like, okay, but I don't have a person to hand that to. And so dealing with the realities of how much we can train somebody. And you talked about, just got the first plant in how many centuries, right? Being real, about what's a good fit for making progress. So what's a training tool and what's actual assistance? And we have a network of the grant writing assistants. We have networks of circuit writers and that sort of thing. Making sure that we're thinking about providing it in those kind of ways too. And not just, here's the website.
Right, so you're saying instead of just handing them a tool, handing them that technical assistance, providing that technical assistance as well. And not just saying it's out there, do it yourself.
Yeah. And, I think and like on the grant front, they are the expert in their community. Having to tap their expertise and being trained. So maybe that's our training and assistance. Translating and
I would add that too, Ron, I think with the plain language executive order referencing the use of plain language and our information, et cetera.
Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, are we, and remind me, I think you mentioned this is just kind of the first pass. Are we trying to put all of these forward? How many recommendations are we trying to put forward? And because I'm just trying to think about these in the terms of like the scope of the working group and then also the commission at large. And I think for me, the one I'm having the hardest time with is the grant processes. And I think that's because so much of like the original funding source that comes in to fund grants is dependent on that funding source, right? Like MDOT's grants that we give to communities is dependent on the federal funding source it comes from. MDOT runs its grants very differently than like DNR is going to run its grants. And so I'm wondering if that level of granularity is something that the commission could even, or this working group could even kind of have influence on. So unless we're trying to put all 5 forward, I was trying to kind of prioritize in my brain a little bit what these are.
So we can put as many forward as we feel is warranted. So we could put all 5 forward. That being said, we're going to still do the offline vote for the ARWG members exclusively, where they ultimately will decide if we do agree to put them forward or not. And so that can be the deciding factor. If we really don't feel that's within our purview, that can be captured in the vote. And I think that's a fair statement that we are restricted in some ways, but I think that putting a recommendation out there that we do what we can to make them more flexible is still, even if it's not possible, it's showing that it's top of mind and it's important, I think could be a statement in of itself.
Dave in the room and then Sarah Bender online.
And I'm not an official member of the ARWG, so I don't want to manipulate your recommendations per se, except I would probably couch, 3 of them really have to do about enhancing community engagement one way or another. And I would probably make that like one recommendation. You want to enhance community engagement, and you could do that through, DDM and community participation, through things like the resilience authorities and making grants more flexible, right? Those are all sort of related to how adaptation is reflected within, and probably put them in that vein, and focus on perhaps a few other examples of how either the state or the MCCC needs to do a more thorough job in that engagement.
We're doing something similar with the SBWG, where we took a bunch of individual recommendations about methane and combined them into a single overarching recommendation for that. I think that way we're going to have 3 more powerful recommendations than a list of 5.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think it centers the important part there. It's like,
Right. And Sarah Bender.
Thank you. I agree with back to what Allison said on the flexible grant process. I wonder if it would be more impactful if we kind of expanded that to not just say grant processes, but to say either resources or funding sources. That way it's not just money based. If we say resources, that could include like flexible technical assistance and things like that. And if we add funding versus grants, that could include some other programs that we have for like loans and such.
Great suggestion. Writing all this down, just so you know, I don't think I'm on camera, but I am writing it all down, I promise. I also want to capture Frederica in the chat. I see that you made a comment. Did you want to say that out loud?
Sure, thank you. I don't need to, but just emphasizing what other people have done in the room, said in the room. I think these are really nicely pulled together. I think they've done a really nice job of capturing the discussions over the last year. But I do think even today, and the nuances of other people's discussions throughout the year, is that if there's a way in the language to make it sound, as Dave was also emphasizing, community centered around the community and community participatory and community driven. I think the way these read, they still sound a little bit more like outreach rather than engagement, like there's a one-way street. And I think to get the MCCC to sound like this is a collective effort that we're all in for climate and that all voices are valued would be helpful. Thank you.
Great, totally got that. I also see, Tom, you put, you asked about climate resiliency being built into comprehensive plans in the chat. Yes, we had put that forward last year as a recommendation. We have the option, we can put that forward again as a recommendation. Do you have feelings about that one way or the other? Or the group have feelings about that one way or the other?
Rylan, do you remember why that wasn't advanced?
There was some discussion about whether it should be its own element or if it should be woven in throughout. It did pass at the commission level, but it didn't get carried into the legislature. So I think it's on MVP's mind, but you know, we can continue to put it forward. And that's why it's great to have Owen here to talk to us about it. It sounds like the work's being carried forward regardless, which is great.
If I might add, we did share our model with MVP and we got feedback from them. I think one of their concerns was the weight that this would have on small jurisdictions that do not have, like they're relying on volunteer planning commissions to implement this. So they recommended like a very watered down version of this just to not confuse them, which I can definitely see there.
No, that's, yeah, we wouldn't want to create an opportunity where the thing we're doing for equity creates inequity.
Yeah, yes, sir.
So it sounds like more work may be being done and we might not need to put that in as a recommendation, but does anybody have feelings on that one way or the other?
I think it's one thing, I know the next gen plan has that local government service delivery. Perhaps that could be something the work group considers prioritizing for that action.
I think I think prioritizing these recommendations, you know, what we're going to see a significantly larger number this year because we have more work groups. And so I think what we want to do here is send up prioritize the list as possible. And probably a shorter, not shorter, but I think where we can combine, that's really important. I really like the idea of taking a focused approach and combining some of the pieces from the few of the recommendations. The implementation of NextGen, because we finalized that plan, right? So we are stepping into that implementation phase now. It feels a little bit like telling us to do the thing we're already doing. So I would throw out there, I wouldn't want to necessarily have that be a recommendation. We're going to do it and have that take place of another maybe more impactful recommendation. So just throwing out there for thought or discussion.
And I should also add, we did have a vote among the ARWG members. The commission steering committee asked that everybody look back at their past recommendations and see if there were any that did not get traction at the time that they were recommended, and re-recommend any of those. And the group did decide to re-recommend one about promoting the next generation adaptation plans, JEDI, which stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion metrics, into each agency's annual reports. So that one will be put forward in addition to this group here. I should have added it, so that's up. But that was our recommendation from last year. Go ahead.
So I can just fill in on some what other states are doing if you're interested to hear some ideas. Just
go for it. Yeah.
New York City, one of their resiliency initiatives has to do with the real estate market and transparency in real estate transactions, just to try to get ahead of repetitive loss properties and disclosures. But that, you know, if you wanted to go in that direction, that there's precedent from New York City from there. North Carolina is doing a lot of initiatives with stream gauges and riverine flooding and understanding where they're at. That would obviously be a lot of money. They have a special tax for it, but you know, that's a big resiliency initiative that they're endeavoring into. Virginia is also doing a little bit with real estate, but they also took the FEMA's state assessment and really ran with it to make a robust permitting process for facilities in the floodplain, state facilities in specific. But there's a lot of examples. Those are just the three that I can probably rattle off the top of my head, but there's a lot of other states out there that are, you know, tackling with resilience initiatives to kind of go through the menu.
I want to build on your comment actually. So New York comes to mind with the New York Climate Smart Communities, and Massachusetts as well with its municipal vulnerability planning assessment, so MVP program that they have. But also there's new guidance coming down federal agencies as well, and I'm not sure if this would be the right mechanism to recommend those things of how are our state agencies staying in line with best available science that's coming through federal agencies. So NOAA, for example, is going to be updating the way we measure precipitation. Atlas 15 is the new tool that'll be coming online soon. FEMA recently updated its flood risk assessment standards. And those are new dynamic tools. So it's not necessarily published maps. It's things online that you can play with and change things around and see with different timestamps how flooding will impact different areas. And the community rating system from FEMA is another example of an incentive program that if private property owners incorporate resilience within their planning and within their structures, they're able to get a lot of they're able to get discounts on their flood insurance. So finding ways to incentivize that at the state level would be something that I think would really help our community partners. But these recommendations don't have a lot of flesh and bones on them. They're just areas that we have started looking into. So just wanted to bring that up.
We interestingly enough had a Coastmark Council meeting earlier. We talked about the new FFRMS, and good to know that it's based off of what we're doing in Maryland for the craft players. That one we are fairly well connected on, but I think to your point, making sure that we are sharing resources, bringing some of the federal resources and innovations into the space is an important one. I think for a couple of the ones from Eileen, I think one, a really good ideas for us too for next year to bring in, to have some of those deeper conversations to flesh out those recommendations. I think the real estate one is really interesting. And we did have insurance MIA conversation around real estate as well. I think that was this last year. But it all runs together as well. But I do think that that's a space where when we start talking about things that impact people on a much more regular basis, like buying and selling properties is a really important place where people are making very big decisions, and bringing that data and informing them is really important. And Jeff, delegate sign apologies. We had the dynamic microphone that was in this room break. And now we are on a single mic. So it is a little bit, I'll try to make sure to talk a little louder. Apologies. And we'll get that fixed for next time. What other ideas jump to mind, or do we want to move to the Mentimeter?
Yeah, let's give one more opportunity to open the floor. Yeah, Anne?
Saying maybe take a pass on the next gen. I would say, is there some piece of the next gen that we want to really prioritize?
The justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion metrics will be in this round of recommendations.
What about, is there stuff on land conservation, working lands, and workforce development? Also big parts of that. Something particular to that that's.
Well, Catherine suggested some of the local government stuff be carried in. I think with next gen it's tricky because it's all we could put all next gen part of it a priority.
Credit in.
Any suggestions?
So the land conservation, really comes to mind because we're also going to be looking at that as new elements in the Chesapeake Bay restoration, reinforcing that it's a really critical piece that I've been working in this space for a lot of decades now. We need to have the emphasis on just conserving.
I think we could include that in the recommendation on funding, right? Because I think a lot of that is related to acquisition funding of easement dollars. So maybe we include that in that piece so we can maximize the bang for the buck on the 3, 4, 5 recommendations. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, the other element that we're going to be looking for is a management piece. So we're conserving land, acreage, basis control, so the fire risk, mitigating fire risk. Those are all things that we would be talking about.
One more time, call anyone online want to say anything before we move on to the Mentimeter?
Okay, get out your smartphone. Or if you have kids that watch Sesame Street, get out Smarty.
Somebody has a kid. All right.
My kids did not have smart.
So what you're going to see here is I've just included in the first slide the 5 that I pitched to you just a minute ago. But the next slide will be that open opportunity. If maybe you were too shy to say it out loud, you can feel free to type it on your smartphone and add any other additional recommendations or thoughts that you wanted to share. And I'll remind everybody that it is an anonymous resource. So don't worry about, being held to your words or anything. And I think this hopefully will allow more of you to participate meaningfully. Okay, so question number 1 is just a ranking of those 5. I guess I should also add these obviously don't reflect the alterations in wording that we just discussed or the combinations that we discussed. So I will do my best to incorporate those after the meeting. Does anybody in the room need the, I realize it's so tiny. The numbers. Okay, the numbers. 3319 9224. Sorry, guys. All right, looks like things are slowing down. So I am going to move on to the next question, which is just the open-ended. If you have any suggestions or ideas, this could be new recommendations. This could be, again, like we've heard, combining recommendations, changing in wordings, et cetera, et cetera.
You're probably gonna need to read these.
Good idea. So we have everyone required to do a climate training, and that was further clarified that every state employee required to do a climate training. Combining the community-based recommendations, which I think we definitely agree with. Advocating for new funding streams to support implementation of NextGen. Definitely funding is a huge issue. Empowering state and local regulators to enforce existing law with regards to environmental impacts of development. If including climate and comprehensive plans, if we are going to advance that again, including very specific examples or resources such as people who they can contact for technical assistance. Supporting resilience authorities would need an action to support that recommendation. I think that's a good comment. State goals for resilience. I think Mike Hinson is going to be working on that one. Land conservation funding, including good management and best management practices, including an equity focus. Updating NextGen recommendations to focus on 1 to 3 actions that lend themselves to cross ARWG membership progress. Community workshops for things like policy, allowing people to work together on policy and helping them understand how proposed bills might impact them. A lot of great suggestions in here. For the trainings, someone is suggesting case studies or weekly trainings to get people familiar with new tools, such as this new sea level rise tool, assigning them homework or questions that people are familiar. In the previous exercise, rank NextGen low, so other actions focused on local actions. State leadership, not just pushing that down to local governments. Carrying the 3 NextGen focus group sections of NextGen, and thus encompass all the sector groups. So focusing more on those priorities rather than the sector groups, since they are all encompassing. Got a lot of great ideas here. I appreciate everyone's participation here, and I want to remind everyone too that my inbox will remain open. If anything comes to you later, feel free to send it via email. As Secretary Kurtz mentioned earlier, these recommendations are due to the commission on the 11th, so we'll need to be voting ahead of that. So I'm going to work on crafting these thoughts and turning them around into our official recommendations, and then those will go out to the membership for a final formal vote. Comment periods first, and then a final formal vote prior to the 11th. So we're just about at the end of the recommendation season, but it's been great discussion. So thank you all.
And Brian, I think there's a lot of really good ideas about implementation of next gen, and I think we could have a more like a detailed focused conversation about that at the next meeting. Once we get past the recommendations, next gen is now finalized.
Yep.
So just wanted to throw that out there for everybody who has next gen recommendations. I think a lot of this is there's some great ideas, and I think we should get into the weeds a little bit more on that implementation this year. So yeah, as Rylan said, we'll take this information, we'll summarize it, and I will check back in with the steering committee for the Climate Commission. We'll decide on the total number that we'll be looking to put forward. And once we have these crafted, we'll call for a vote, and then we'll make sure that that's posted on the ARWG website as part of the Climate Commission, so everyone can see what we're sending up to the commission itself on the 11th. So thank you all very much for that conversation. Look forward to your feedback, and then to ultimately to the vote on those recommendations from the ARWG in the next couple weeks. Fantastic. All right, so we are going to move on to the public comment phase of our meeting now. If you are online and you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you are in the room and like to make a public comment, we'll start there first. Is there anybody in the room who would like to make a public comment? Seeing none. Is there anyone online who would like to make a public comment? All right, hearing none. Thank you all very much for another great ARWG meeting. As always, if you have ideas, and Eileen, I'm going to follow up with you about presenters to really see these discussions and help us continue to build robust recommendations every year. We really appreciate that. So please send them to Ryland. And again, if you were a member of the ARWG, voting member of ARWG, keep your eyes out for the email from Ryland with all of the information about voting and our recommendation package. And then we'll have, I think, a deeper dive conversation about next gen at our next meeting, which is on November 20th. Same time, same place. And again, thank you all very much. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Oh, I don't need a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned.